For any parent, a child is the most important thing in the world, so important that all other glory and achievement pale in comparison. Yet for some Hollywood stars at the height of their fame, this sacred bond was formed in the most ruthless moment of their lives when a child was born with a disability or a life-threatening illness, forcing them to turn their backs on the spotlight and confront a reality for which no one is ever prepared. Some stepped away from the peak of stardom to remain beside their child day after day. Some burned through fortunes and hope alike in desperate medical battles. And there were moments no one dares to name when Hollywood legends were left without roles, without applause, with only the stifled sobs of a mother or father, powerless in the face of fate. Prepare yourself. The stories that follow will not only move you to tears, but also strip away the illusion behind Hollywood's dazzling glow. And the first story begins with a legendary name, Elizabeth Taylor. 1. Elizabeth Taylor, when a legend chose to step back. In 1963, inside a private clinic in Los Angeles, Elizabeth Taylor sat still as the doctor closed the file. She did not ask questions. She only nodded slightly when told that her son would need lifelong care. There were no tears in that moment, but it split her life cleanly into two distinct halves. Christopher Wilding never entered the world of spotlights. Elizabeth made sure of that. While the press continued to track every premiere and public appearance, she quietly narrowed the boundaries of her life, turning her home into a space deliberately sealed off from Hollywood. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Major projects were declined officially for health reasons. On the surface, it looked like the fatigue of a movie star. In reality, her schedule revolved around her son's neurological therapy sessions. Elizabeth often left film sets early, removing her jewelry in the car, as if she did not want to carry any trace of her roles back home. Before entering Christopher's room, she would pause for a few seconds, take a deep breath, and only then open the door. Inside, there were no cameras, no lights, only a child who did not respond to his mother's voice, and a woman learning day after day how to live with that reality. At medical evaluations, Elizabeth spoke little. She sat beside her son, listened to the same clinical terminology repeated over and over, and asked only one question. Is there anything different today from yesterday? Most of the time, the answer was no. Still, she showed up consistently punctually, as if her presence was the one thing she could still control. Hollywood never explicitly told her to hide her child, but every signal was clear enough for Elizabeth to understand that a disabled child had no place beside the flawless icon they had constructed. She did not fight it. She chose silence, allowing her son to exist outside the public narrative. Christopher grew up in a world without reporters, where ordinary moments were neither documented nor shared. Elizabeth Taylor maintained her role before the public eye, but once the doors closed, she became a mother whose days were shaped by waiting. Waiting for a small movement, an unexpected response. A reason to believe that stepping away from the spotlight had been worth it. Elizabeth Taylor did not leave Hollywood with a dramatic declaration. She retreated gradually, step by step, choosing the bedside over the red carpet again and again. The sacrifice produced no climax, no triumphant moment, and was never framed as legend. Yet it was precisely in that quiet withdrawal that Elizabeth Taylor gave up the most valuable currency of stardom, visibility, to do the one thing she could not refuse: remain a mother to a child untouched by stage lights. But not everyone chose concealment as Elizabeth Taylor did. Robert Redford made the opposite choice, walking away from Hollywood entirely when his son stood at the edge of life and death. 2. Robert Redford, the man who stepped out of the spotlight to stay with his son. In 1959, Robert Redford was still a young actor struggling to survive in Hollywood. He took small roles, moved from one audition to the next, and understood all too well that missing the early window could mean losing his chance entirely. It was precisely at that moment that life forced him onto a different path. Scott Redford's first son was born with severe respiratory instability. The doctors offered no comforting assurances. They explained only that episodes of apnea could occur at any time, especially during sleep. There was no safe milestone, no point at which anyone could say with confidence that the child would wake up the next morning. From that day on, Redford no longer lived by Hollywood's schedule. At night, he often sat beside the crib for hours, listening intently to the pauses between breaths. If the silence stretched even slightly longer than usual, he would spring up immediately, calling his son's name, waiting for the faint sound of breathing to return. Nights like this repeated themselves until the idea of a full night's sleep disappeared from his life entirely. Meanwhile, Hollywood kept calling. His agent reminded him that this was not a phase he could afford to miss, that a young actor had to be seen in the right places at the right times if he wanted to be remembered. Redford heard these warnings in hospital rooms, then quietly declined. He skipped meetings, neglected the relationships he was expected to cultivate, and was repeatedly absent from places where his presence was considered essential. His time was divided between the hospital and the house where Scott slept, haunted by the fear that if he stayed away too long, he might not return in time. Scott was hospitalized multiple times during his first year of life. Redford often stood against the wall of the emergency room, hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the child breathing with the help of machines. He did not ask long questions. He did not look for miracles. He simply stayed until things were temporarily stable again. Then one night, Scott stopped breathing in his sleep. By the time the doctors arrived, every intervention was too late. Redford was at home that night, not because he had missed work, but because he had never been away from his son long enough for absence to be the right word. Even so, his presence could not change the outcome. Scott's death never became a widely told story. Redford did not allow that private loss to be turned into public narrative. He withdrew from the center of Hollywood life, distancing himself from places where lights and questions could transform his son's death into spectacle. In the years that followed, Redford lived quietly, maintaining a deliberate distance from fame. When he eventually returned to filmmaking and rose to stardom, that restraint never left him. He appeared less, spoke less, and kept his private life firmly sealed. The educational, medical, and community arts initiatives he later supported were done without public credit, without image building, without calls for attention. For Redford, they were simply a way to continue doing something meaningful, after having once stood powerless while his son slipped away. As Redford chose to step back from the spotlight, Judy Garland was consumed by it, along with a painful secret about children born into chaos. 3. Judy Garland, the child who had to be hidden from the light. Judy Garland sang of places where troubles melted away, yet her real life was bound to the windowless corridors of MGM. There, every emotion had to run on schedule, every body had to function like a machine, and any sign of instability, no matter how small, was treated as a direct threat to profit. When Garland gave birth, the fear that had always hovered behind the stage curtains suddenly took on a concrete form. The child was frail, frequently in need of medical care, and every whispered diagnosis triggered the same response: conceal a little more. There were no family photo sessions, no moments of cradling her child in front of cameras. Doctor visits were broken into short trips, constantly rescheduled, routed through side exits, back seats of cars. Garland learned to hold her child below eye level, to turn her body to block lenses, and to smile as though there were nothing worth asking about. What she sacrificed was not fame, but presence. On nights when her child ran a high fever, Garland still stood under the lights, her voice forced upward by stimulants, her anxiety pressed down by sedatives. She memorized doctors' instructions because she dared not keep papers anywhere they might be searched. Phone calls to check on her child were made in bathrooms, water running continuously to mask the tremor in her voice. When shooting schedules tightened, she nodded. When tour dates were added, she adjusted. Each time she asked to slow down to be with her child, the price was a reminder that never needed to be spoken aloud. Hollywood does not wait for mothers. MGM knew, and they chose the most efficient form of silence, keeping Garland busy. Work filled every gap, leaving her no time to be weak and no space to resist. The child was pushed out of the spotlight to preserve the image. The mother was held at the center of the stage to preserve revenue. This sacrifice came without statements, without public tragedy, only with Garland arriving earlier to set leaving later and learning how to bow her head quickly before the makeup began to run. Only later, when her body could no longer endure the pace, did the fragments begin to surface. Rushed trips between soundstage and hospital performances cut short a voice that trembled not because of dramatic climax, but from exhaustion. This was not a sudden collapse. It was the outcome of a long chain of choices, one in which Judy Garland traded her own safety so that her child could exist outside Hollywood's unforgiving glare. She did not tell this story while she was still at her peak, because in Hollywood's golden age, a suffering mother was not an image that sold tickets. Garland understood this clearly. To protect her child, she had to accept becoming someone who was not allowed to break until the lights themselves did it for her. But if Judy Garland was forced to hide in silence, the next figure allowed pain to erupt into direct confrontation. And that name was Marlon Brando. 4. Marlon Brando, the child hidden behind a legend's rage. In 1958, Marlon Brando was entering the most powerful phase of his life. After The Young Lions, he was no longer merely a bankable actor, but Hollywood's new icon, instinctive, volatile, uncontrollable. The call from Cedars of Lebanon Hospital came on an ordinary afternoon without drama or music. The doctor spoke slowly and carefully, as if each word might fracture something fragile. The child showed signs of developmental delay, would require long-term monitoring, and his future could not be predicted. Brando said nothing. The only question he asked had nothing to do with medicine. He asked whether this would get out. Christian Brando was born at the same moment his father was being elevated as a new model of American masculinity. Those two images were never allowed to exist side by side. While the studios cultivated Brando as a wild, untamable legend, the child was kept behind closed doors. No family photographs, no statements. In internal records, Christian's name was reduced to neutral placeholders enough to stop further questions. His existence was treated as a professional liability. Brando chose a form of protection that was strange but effective. He became abrasive with the press-cut interviews, short-picked fights with journalists, and leaned into the persona of the unmanageable rebel. Each public outburst redirected attention elsewhere. People talked about Brando being difficult, self-destructive, arrogant, and no one asked why he vanished without explanation, or why the houses he rented were always sealed behind high walls. In those gaps, Christian grew up with tutors, psychologists, and rigid schedules that ran like clockwork. Brando despised the press, but now that hatred was calculated. He was willing to let his public image deteriorate so long as his son was not dragged into the light. Hollywood was far more forgiving of a rebellious genius than of a father with a weakness that could not be concealed. Throughout the 1960s, as Brando repeatedly withdrew from promotional campaigns, rumors spread along familiar lines: alcohol, instability, collapse. He did not correct them. Staying busy with roles helped him avoid more dangerous questions. Each canceled shoot meant more time for extended therapy sessions, more emotional eruptions without an audience. In 1968, an indiscreet remark at a Beverly Hills party brushed too close to the boundary Brando had guarded for a decade. The next morning, he canceled everything and took Christian away from Los Angeles. No sets, no lights, no role was important enough to trade for his son's safety. 30 years later, the final tragedy would still erupt in public, the very outcome Brando had spent his life trying to delay. But before the world witnessed that reckoning, Hollywood knew only an angry legend. It did not see the father who sacrificed image power, and ultimately much of his career, to keep his child away from a light that could destroy everything. If Brando concealed the truth through fury, the next woman on this list chose the opposite path. Absolute silence, Angie Dickinson. 5. Angie Dickinson, the woman who turned silence into armor. There was no single day on which Angie Dickinson fell. No accident, no fateful phone call, no surgeon stepping out of an operating room with a rigid expression. Hollywood simply, almost imperceptibly, stopped seeing her. A name once plastered across posters quietly vanished from parties, premieres, and industry columns. The disappearance was so smooth it never registered as a rupture. Angie let people fill in the gaps themselves. Some said she had grown tired of the spotlight. Others claimed she had become too selective. A few whispered that her marriage to Burt Bacharach had drained her. None of these explanations reached the center of the truth inside a discreet house in Los Angeles. Angie was living by hospital schedules, not studio call sheets. Her daughter Nikki was born into circumstances that ran counter to every Hollywood instinct. No cameras waiting. No carefully managed mother and baby are doing well headlines. No staged photographs designed to reassure the public that everything was normal. Nikki grew up outside the frame not because Angie wanted a normal child, but because her daughter could never be allowed to be measured against the flawless image Hollywood had imposed on the mother. Signs of trouble appeared early. Medical appointments multiplied, fitted carefully into the absences Angie carved out of her work life. Roles were declined without explanation. Television contracts were accepted only with unspoken conditions: no long-distance shoots, no punishing schedules, no scrutiny of her private life. Angie learned how to remain a star only when every variable was controlled. Unlike Brando, who used abrasiveness to push the press away, Angie repelled no one. She smiled. She answered just enough. She turned politeness into her most effective barrier. Nannies, doctors, and a small circle of confidants all understood a single rule: Nikki did not exist in Angie Dickinson's public narrative. The more she withdrew from social life, the more she was praised as a woman who valued privacy. Hollywood never realized it was helping her conceal a reality that, if exposed, could have ended every role available to her. As Nikki grew older and her condition became harder to manage, Angie compressed her world to its smallest possible scale. Acting became part-time work. The spotlight was something that could be switched on and off by contract. Her daughter's illness could not. There was no dramatic climax, only exhaustion accumulating year after year in a life no audience was invited to witness. Angie Dickinson did not hide by lying. She hid by denying Hollywood the chance to ask the right questions. And in an industry accustomed to consuming tragedy in exchange for immaculate images, that strategy worked for decades. The next star chose the opposite path: to place tragedy directly before the camera, to turn it into fuel, and to confront Hollywood head-on. His name was Sylvester Stallone. 6. Sylvester Stallone. The decision that could not be undone. The moment that altered the trajectory of Sylvester Stallone's life did not take place in a hospital room or on a red carpet. It happened behind closed doors in a quiet meeting where a sanitized version of his story was placed in front of him. A few personal details to be removed, a sensitive question to be avoided. An extra smile suggested to keep the narrative smooth. Stallone skimmed the pages, then closed them. He understood immediately: if he agreed to the edits, Hollywood would be satisfied. If he refused, the cost would follow him for years. In the early 1980s, Rocky propelled Stallone to the peak of fame, turning him into a global symbol of grit and resilience. At the same time, away from the cameras, his son Sergio was diagnosed with a severe developmental disorder. There was no public announcement, no interview framed as a triumph over adversity. Only tightly scheduled therapy sessions, circuitous car routes to avoid photographers, and a child's name quietly withdrawn from the family narrative. Stallone responded in the way he knew best, by throwing himself into work. He trained harder, filmed more, and presented an image of physical perfection. Every sculpted muscle became an assertion that his life remained intact. Beneath that exterior, however, contracts were renegotiated to allow him to return home. Quickly, promotional tours were shortened, and evenings were kept deliberately empty. Sergio did not stand beside his father on red carpets, did not appear in released family photographs, did not become material for headlines. Over time, the media settled on a more convenient explanation. Stallone was labeled egotistical, difficult, stubbornly resistant to the system. These descriptions fed the appetite for spectacle while obscuring the truth. Stallone did not object. He allowed the public to believe the issue was temperament because that version provoked far less curiosity than the reality of a movie star with a child who could not be molded into an inspirational storyline. At one point, his publicists proposed a softer approach, a vague account of a private period, a temporary hardship to be overcome. Stallone refused, not because he wanted to expose his pain, but because he would not lie. His silence was confrontational in its own way. No revisions, no glossing over, no turning his son's life into marketable content. On screen, Rocky always rises after every blow. Off screen, Stallone learned to accept a battle with no final round. There was no rousing climax, no applause. Only incremental progress punctuated by inevitable setbacks endured in silence. Hollywood prefers stories that can be neatly resolved. Stallone understood this and accepted the price, years of being seen as repetitive, rigid, unwilling to evolve. Yet that refusal to rewrite the script preserved one essential thing: Sergio's life outside the spotlight. Stallone absorbed the criticism in public so that his son would never be reduced to a role in Hollywood's narrative. If Stallone confronted the system with cold, unyielding honesty, the next figure believed that love and faith could replace concealment altogether: John Travolta. 7. John Travolta, a father who laid his fame at his child's feet. John Travolta never said that he sacrificed his career for his son. He never framed it as a story of devotion to be retold under studio lights. Yet for many years, nearly every decision he made revolved around a single question: how to ensure that Jet could live in peace, even if the price was Travolta's own standing in Hollywood. When Jet was young, Travolta was enjoying one of the rare second ascents in American cinema. After Pulp Fiction, he was once again in demand, hailed as a revitalized icon, a man the public wanted to believe was complete and untroubled, both on screen and off. Behind that image, however, his life was quietly reordered. Work schedules no longer prioritized prestige projects, but travel distance. Attractive offers were declined because they would keep him away from home too long. Promotional tours were shortened so he could return to his son as quickly as possible. Family life became a series of careful, silent adjustments. Homes were redesigned around safety rather than comfort. Vacations were chosen for calm and predictability, not luxury. Travolta's evenings did not end at parties or industry dinners, but with medication checks, monitoring sleep, and long sleepless nights when seizures struck. He could face thousands of spectators without hesitation, yet sit motionless for hours, listening only to make sure his son's breathing remained steady. Travolta accepted the erosion of his public image as part of that bargain. By refusing to tell the kind of overcoming adversity story Hollywood prefers, he also refused the applause that usually comes with it. By avoiding public discussion of his son's condition, he invited speculation, doubt, and quiet judgment. For Travolta, that silence was not avoidance, it was armor. It did not protect his reputation, it protected a child who could not protect himself. Only when tragedy finally occurred did many realize that John Travolta had been living for years, primarily as a father, not a star. What he lost cannot be measured in awards or roles passed over. It was opportunities quietly surrendered, years compressed around the needs of one child, and a life deliberately structured, so that safety always came before ambition. John Travolta's sacrifice was not dramatic, not celebrated at the right moment, and it did not lead to a comforting resolution. Yet in that quiet endurance, his love is unmistakable. A father willing to place all his fame beneath his child's feet, to stand in the shadows himself as long as his son could remain in a place of safety for as long as possible. If Travolta believed that time and faith might delay tragedy, Tierney would confront something far more unforgiving. 8. Tierney, a mother who carried the entire tragedy in her child's place. Tierney was once the embodiment of the perfection Hollywood craved: a flawless face, a cool, distant presence, a beauty so precise that the camera seemed to step back to accommodate it. But from the moment her daughter was born, everything Jean had protected throughout her career began to recede piece by piece, making room for a role that would never be credited: a mother who devoted her life to a child who could not live independently. The child did not enter the world with a strong, reassuring cry. Jean sensed something was wrong the instant her daughter was placed in her arms. The silence lasted longer than it should have. In the days that followed, Jean walked the hospital corridors, learning to read the carefully measured words of doctors and learning how not to cry when she understood that her child would never have a normal life. From that moment on, Jean began a quiet withdrawal. There was no announcement of retirement, no statement, no narrative crafted for the press. Her filming schedule gradually thinned. Roles were declined without explanation. Promising contracts no longer carried enough weight to pull her away from the room where her daughter required constant care. Jean shifted her life into a different rhythm. The rhythm of medication treatment schedules, sleepless nights and mornings that always began with the same recurring fear. Her sacrifice was not loud, but it consumed her from the inside. Years of caregiving brought no progress, only repetition. Each day was a reminder that effort would not produce a miracle. Jean carried that despair so her daughter would not have to. She allowed herself to fracture in silence rather than expose her child to a world that had no place for her. When Jean disappeared from Hollywood for long stretches, it was labeled a decline. In truth, it was the cost of a very clear choice. She did not leave the spotlight because she failed. She stepped away because there was a life that needed her more than any role ever could. Jean Tierney traded her immortal beauty to preserve her daughter's protected existence. She traded her career to safeguard the dignity of a child who could not speak for herself. And for the rest of her life, she lived with fractures that never healed. Not as a fallen star, but as a mother who had given everything she had. Jean Tierney's greatness was not on screen. It lived in the years no camera recorded, where she chose to love her child so completely that she accepted disappearing herself. The next figure would encounter collapse from a different direction, not through a sick child, but through loving someone already crushed by tragedy. His name was Arthur Miller. 9. Arthur Miller, when fame steps aside for a child's right to live. Arthur Miller once believed that life's greatest tragedies were rooted in moral choice. But standing in a delivery room, listening as a doctor spoke softly that his newborn son had severe Down syndrome, Miller learned something harsher. Some tragedies require no choice at all. They arrive on their own and demand that you live with them for the rest of your life. Daniel was born fragile, barely responsive. In those first hours, Miller did not leave the incubator. He counted each breath, noted every small movement, as if afraid that turning away, even for a moment, would allow life to slip through his hands. The doctors made no promises. They spoke plainly about complications, repeated hospitalizations, and a future that would never resemble that of other children. From that moment, Arthur Miller stepped away from Hollywood. He declined film projects already waiting for him, canceled meetings with producers. The premieres and dinner parties disappeared from his calendar. In their place came long drives to hospitals, exhausting consultations with specialists, sleepless nights when Daniel suffered seizures and had to be rushed into emergency care. Miller did not speak to the press. He did not explain himself to friends. He simply vanished. Daniel required constant care. Miller learned to recognize danger from the slightest change in his son's face. Some nights he held Daniel in his arms until morning, completely still, no hope that his son would speak, no expectation that he would understand, only the quiet wish that he would keep breathing. In those moments, Miller was utterly powerless. No language, no script, no moral philosophy could help him. Rumors began to circulate in artistic circles. People said Miller had collapsed, that he had isolated himself, that his career was over. No one knew that behind closed doors was a father trading his life's work for his child's survival. He withdrew not out of failure, but because he could not stand under the spotlight while watching his son lie in a hospital bed. The plays Miller wrote during this period changed noticeably: fewer climaxes, more silence. Characters no longer argued fiercely, they endured quietly. It was not a stylistic experiment, it was the mark of a man exhausted beyond words, yet unwilling to walk away. There were moments when doctors said Daniel might not survive. Miller signed medical consent forms with trembling hands, not from fear of losing his reputation, but from fear that he had not done enough. Not quickly enough, not forcefully enough to keep his son alive. Daniel survived. Not healthy, Not typical, but alive. And for Miller, that was everything. Arthur Miller never turned his son into a public narrative. He chose to love in silence, to let fame retreat into the background. For him, this was not a noble sacrifice. It was simply the only thing a father could do. If Arthur Miller stepped away from the spotlight to shield his child from it, the next figure, Toni Braxton, would be forced to confront that same pain in the harshest possible place, center stage, where her child's life unfolded before millions of eyes. 10. Toni Braxton. When the stage goes dark and a mother's battle begins. One evening in 2007, Toni Braxton was standing in a recording studio, unable to sing a single note. Her phone vibrated. It was a call from her son's doctor. The voice on the other end did not soften the message or ease her into it. There was only a diagnosis spoken slowly and plainly. Autism. No crying. No screaming. Toni sat motionless for a long time, her hand still resting on her headphones, as if by holding that position her old life might return. It didn't. Diesel was 4 years old at the time. He avoided eye contact. He did not respond to music, something that felt almost impossible in the Braxton family. Toni began to notice the small signs she had previously convinced herself to ignore. Her son did not call her, Mom did not respond when held, retreated into his own world even when the entire family was nearby. Hollywood knew nothing, and Toni made sure it stayed that way. She canceled promotional schedules, declined interviews, appeared in public with a flawless smile as though nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, she spent hours learning early intervention techniques, studying speech therapy, and practicing patience. As her son struck the wall in frustration, unable to express what he wanted. In 2008, Toni withdrew from her tour. There was no press release, no clear explanation. The media speculated that she was burned out past her prime or simply no longer relevant. Toni did not correct them. She allowed her career to be misunderstood as long as her son was spared public scrutiny. Sleepless nights followed. Costly therapy sessions. Moments of helplessness when Diesel refused to eat, refused to speak, refused to be touched. Toni once confided to a close friend that there were times she sat alone in her car crying until she could barely breathe, simply because her son called out to her, but in a sound only she could understand. The real drama was not scandal, but the price she paid. Toni filed for bankruptcy a second time. Millions of dollars vanished. Music contracts stalled. Producers turned away. A diva who had once dominated the charts accepted life outside the spotlight, becoming a full-time mother nurse and therapist to her own child. She kept Diesel's condition private until 2011, not out of fear, but because only once her son showed progress did she feel able to speak. That was the first time Toni faced the media not as a singer, but as a mother voicing her deepest fear. Fear of labels, fear of pity. Fear that the world would be harsher than anything she could shield her child from. At one point, Toni believed music had left her entirely. Then Diesel. The boy who once showed no reaction to sound began to hum along to simple melodies. The notes were unclear, the rhythm imperfect. But it was enough for Toni to believe the fight still held hope. Toni Braxton did not trade fame in a single dramatic decision. She traded it day by day, every canceled show, every missed opportunity, every choice to stay home instead of stepping onto the stage. Hollywood never filmed those moments, yet they became the greatest role of her life. And when Toni eventually returned to the spotlight, her voice was deeper, slower, as if every note had passed through a battle for survival. Not to earn applause, but to prove that some mothers win in ways no audience ever sees. Hollywood is not built solely on spotlights and legends, but also on silences that last a lifetime. Behind every celebrated icon are fathers and mothers who willingly stepped away from the spotlight at the very moment their names were being called, the loudest choosing, instead to remain beside children who may not have fit the screen's definition of perfection, but who were their entire world. Fame can be traded away. Roles can disappear. But parenthood offers no alternative except to stay to endure and to carry the weight. If you believe these quiet sacrifices deserve to be seen clearly, like and follow to continue exploring the shadows Hollywood has never wanted illuminated. Because there are stories not meant for the spotlight, but worthy of being remembered.